Part two of the Handey microservice discussion is going to focus on the quote repositories and the various ways that those are implemented. And we're going to see there are three different things that matter here. And all of these use R2DBC. And this is important because this is what you need to be aware of for your assignment to see. It's very similar to this. So what we're doing is we're providing a persistent repository that contains quote objects, and we use the R2DBC reactive database as the means for being able to query and access the contents reactively. The Handey quote repository is a class that, sorry, it's actually an interface that is going to extend two other interfaces, a multi-query repository that we write, and the reactive CRUD repository that we get out of the box from R2DBC. So here's what the code actually looks like. R2DBC allows programs and programmers to access and interact with relational databases in a reactive and non-blocking manner. Super cool. Not quite as mature in some ways as JPA, but very cool. Here's the interface. It's a repository, so we can do the CRUD operations on it, most importantly, querying. We extend the reactive CRUD repository, which comes out of the box, and this allows you to use project reactor types with reactive streams and asynchronous database access. It's parameterized by two elements. One is the quote, which is the item that's in the database. That's a record, for example. It's a row in the database. And then we also have an integer, which is the primary key. That's the quote class we'd looked at before. And we mark that as an entity so it knows exactly how that works. Then we also have the multi-query repository. And this defines the way to be able to perform multiple queries on the quote database. This is the most important part, which we're going to focus on in a second. But before we get there, let's take a look at an easy one first. There's a method defined here called find by quote containing ignore case. That's just good old Spring Data API keywords. And what it's going to do is it's going to asynchronously find all the rows in this particular table in the database that contain some instance of the query that's passed as a parameter, ignoring the case. So containing means just search for this somewhere in the table row. Look for anything that has that query as the field in the database. And so we're looking at the quote field, we're looking for a containment, and we're ignoring the case. And it returns a flux to a quote. This is what happens under the hood where Spring Data API generates this query. We don't have to write this query, but this is what it's doing. It's selecting from the quote table where lowercase quote is like the lowercase query. So it's basically just doing sort of it's like the Java method contains. So if you look for rich in the Handey quote repository, it'll come back with I'd rather be rich than stupid because it found rich here. Much more interesting, however, is the multi-query repository, and there's two different variants of that. We have multi-query repository, which is an interface, and then we also have the implementation of multi-query repository, which is, as we'll see, where the code actually resides. So let's talk about this. First, we'll talk about the interface. This is a way to perform multiple queries at once on the quote database. We don't get that out of the box. And there are two methods that matter, neither of which we can get out of the box. The first one is going to find a list of quote objects in the database that contain all of the queries, ignoring the case. So find all by quote containing ignore case all in. That's the quasi-Spring Data API keyword name, but Spring doesn't do that for us automatically, so we have to write this ourselves as a custom query. And here's an example. If we are going to look for all quotes that have both the word cry and laugh in the quote, then if we do that query, we'll find it'll match. It takes a big man to cry, but it takes a bigger man to laugh at that man. And here's what the actual SQL query would be. To do that, you select from the quote table where the quote is going to be a match of both cry and laugh. So that's essentially where that comes from. You can't get that automatically through Spring Data API keywords. The second version is very similar, except this time it's going to look for any as opposed to all. So it's going to find quote objects in the database that contain any of the queries in this list, ignoring the case. So here's an example similar to before. If you look for all the queries that contain either cry or face, then you'll get a match for the it takes a big man to cry, and it also matched to the face of a child says it all, especially the mouth parts of the face. And the actual SQL query that corresponds to that is almost identical to the one before, the difference being that it has an or here as opposed to an and. And the key point is that you can't get this automatically by using the Spring Data API. So instead, we have to use custom queries. Now, how this works is we implement a class called multi-query repository impl, which implements multi-query repository. And this applies the Spring repository implementation pattern. You can read about that here in my ChatGPT session, which is very useful to know about because it's hard to find this description anywhere else by searching for it. The implementation uses something called a database client. With the JPA version of this stuff, which is what we used for assignment 2B, that used an entity manager. Now we're using a database client, which is very similar to Entity Manager. It's just something that will work with non-blocking reactive code to perform the CRUD and query calls. And it also supports reactive streams and back pressure and all this other good stuff. And we'll actually see this get used when we look through the code in detail. So speaking about the code in detail, I'm going to give you this high-level view, and then we're going to look through the code in more detail in the next lesson, next part of the lesson. So here, this is the find all by quote containing ignore case all in, which takes a list of string queries. And we provide strings here, and we're going to build a query string from the strings we provide and the queries, and then we're going to go look things up in the database, and it's going to give us back a flux of quotes. So we will take a look at that code in just a moment.